All right, so following the signing of the Treaty of Neuchota, all the Cherokees are going to have to move to Oklahoma. Okay, all those who supported the treaty and those who didn't. And most in both camps will not leave voluntarily. They're going to wait until they are rounded up by U.S. Army officers and put in detention camps where they're going to be waiting for the forced migration across the eastern southern states to the Mississippi River to cross that, and then to ultimately cross over into Oklahoma territory. Okay. And some people get away because they flee to neighboring states and they become refugees, but most are going to be forced into Oklahoma. And one thing that did not happen, that could have happened, was sort of widespread violence and slaughtering of the Indians. And that was avoided because, partly because of the kind of the leadership negotiating with each other, trying to prevent that from happening and control the white settlers from moving too quickly, or acting, or allowing the federal troops to take, to oversee the removal, right? But nonetheless, an enormously large proportion of the Native Americans are going to die in this process. Very large rate of death for the Cherokees. And part of the problem was the conditions in the detention camps were horrible. There was very poor sanitation. And then the other problem was very harsh winter. And they're being marched overland in winter months, or waiting in camps to march in winter months. And especially the winter of 1838 and 9 was very, very cold. Okay. So this is what we call the Trail of Teal, this overland march of the Cherokee Nation, in which many, many of them die. And there were 12,000 Cherokees that are being forced to migrate, and 4,000 of them die. Right? 4,000 of them die. So that's about a third, right? That's an enormously large proportion of the population. So we call that the Trail of Tears. Now, and once they got to Oklahoma, the leaders of the pro-treaty party of the Cherokees, that was John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, were assassinated, right? Okay. So by 1839, the Creek and the Chickasaw tribes had also undergone kind of coerced removals from Alabama and Mississippi. And the Creeks had probably had the worst fate because they had mounted some resistance, some of them, or some of them had actually been given the opportunity to remain in their lands in Alabama as individual farmers, but these individuals had been overrun as well. Okay. And this is happening kind of in the aftermath of when most of the Creeks have already left, and many of them have to go to become refugees. But then this violence causes resistance on the part of the Creeks starting in 1836. Okay, and this is called the Second Creek War. A lot of them escaped, these Indians escaped to Florida, but the death rates were extraordinarily high for the Creek Nation. Probably about 50% of them are killed as a result of these wars. So very, very brutal implementation of the policy for the Creek Nation. The Seminole Nation in Florida mounts the most effective resistance and long-lasting resistance to the Indian removal policy of all the 5 nations in this region. And they benefited, number one, from the remoteness of Florida, right? It's kind of hard to get down there. And 2, I mean, it's also really hot down there, right? And then also from a very sizable runaway slave population. And Florida had long been a refuge for runaway slaves going back to when the Spanish owned it, right? So, Jackson is going to leave office in 1837, and at that point, the Seminole Nation is still resisting and holding out in Florida. And they're sending federal troops in there, and the federal troops are getting beaten because they can't, engage very effectively with the combination of Indians and black fighters in Florida. But they keep sending the federal troops down there to crush the rebellion and to force their removal. And ultimately, the federal government spends an enormous amount of money in Florida trying to repress the Seminole Nation, 10 times as much money as it had estimated it would spend overall in the entire removal process. Okay? So, as these eastern tribes, also another thing to keep in mind here, as the eastern tribes are relocating to Oklahoma, they're also running into conflict with the people that live there, with the Plains Indians that have some part of the land in Oklahoma, and then that's causing additional violence, right? So it's just kind of this one thing and then another thing, one problem and then another problem, okay? Overall, before the end of Jackson's second term in office, which he leaves office in 1837, 46,000 Native Americans had been dispossessed, and the federal government had obtained 100 million acres of farmland. And most of this farmland was kind of gobbled up, absorbed by speculators, people that have gathered together a lot of money from investors to go out and buy land and sell it at profit, and sell it as high a profit as they can, because there's huge demand for this land. And if they can get it, then they're going to be able to make a ton of money off of it, because the demand is going to rise as the land becomes more and more scarce, right? So the speculators are actually making the biggest bang off of this whole bang for their buck out here with the Indian removal. And Jackson really doesn't make any attempt to stop this, okay? Like, you'd think he would be like, well, this is not Republican virtue with these speculators coming in here and making a lot of profit off of this. But, it's part of it's the way in which he's trying to implement his vision for a nation made up of self-sufficient farmers. And of course, now we see for Jackson, especially, sometimes I call him Jefferson accidentally. I apologize. I don't know every time I do that, but we're talking about Andrew Jackson, right? You know that, but I just need to clarify. Okay, look, but anyway, Jackson, he, but also it's clearly there's this racial element to it for Jackson, obviously, it's white self-sufficient farmers who have black slaves, that's, so that's what it is. And, little more can be said about this whole thing other than that it's an enormous tragedy and an enormous injustice, and there's not any justifying of it. And, it's what we would today call ethnic cleansing, a genocide, right? Forcing migration of people, putting them in detention camps, many of them dying, right? Seizing their property. All of that we would identify as, elements of a genocide or an ethnic cleansing, okay? And it also really reveals the extent to which this Democrat Party that Jackson has founded is tied to white supremacy, to an ideology of white supremacy, okay? The vision for the country is white, okay? This has taken root and amplified itself. It's not something that was inherent in the founding documents, but it's something that has amplified itself in the antebellum period. There is this contingent of people that are making a lot of money off of cotton farming, or lots of people that want to get into it. So it's very important for them to promote these ideologies of racial superiority to justify their exploitation of people and of the property that those people own. And what lies at the heart of this is this moral cancer of slavery and promoting slavery, and as a consequence of that, promoting the removal of the Indians and the mistreatment and the seizure of their property, okay? Now, so we can say, this is, to be honest, this is part of the Democrat Party that Jackson founds, and it remains a strong part of it until after the Civil War. It's also important to note that many Americans of all races are really beginning to mobilize in more effective ways in opposition to these moral evils, okay? So, in 1837, the abolitionist movement is really starting to begin to get it moving, to get going. It's in its earliest stages, but it's starting to roll forward. And the battle over Indian removal for peoples east of the Mississippi River is ended, tragically for them. But the much longer battle over slavery is just beginning to amplify toward a crescendo. So we're going to start talking about now the abolitionist movement and its growth, okay?